welcome to AMV Books and Films. My name is April, and today we're going to be going over Alice Munro's Carried Away. Coming in at only 47 pages, Carried Away is a short story, and within a compilation of Alice Munro's short stories, the compilation Open Secrets, and it is just breathtaking. When I started reading this book, it was just very haunting, and there are definitely somber undertones. The characters are realistic. And even though it is a short story, it sort of reads like a novel because there are many themes and many allusions. And the story follows the main character, Louisa, in significant moments in her life. And just the way the story was written, beautifully written. And it was one of my favorite books so far. The story starts with Louisa, who sits in a dining room of a hotel in a small town in Canada. She has with her a letter from an unknown soldier in World War I. By the name of Jack Agnew. In the letter, he writes that she doesn't know who he is, but he had once went to the library and saw her there, and was grateful that she had organized the books. He talks a little bit about his father's home and the books he had read. She responds kindly and mentions a little bit about the kinds of books that she likes, and they correspond a few more times until he asks her for a picture of herself. She sends it, and he writes back claiming that he may die and that the thought of it steals him in a way that he can say anything that is on his mind. He tells her he loves her. The narrative jumps in time, and Louisa is now at an empty bar with a traveling salesman, and she talks to him about the Spanish flu pandemic. And she says that as a librarian, she kept the library open during the war and during the pandemic because she was waiting for Jack to return. However, one night, a note was left on her desk in her office saying that he was engaged to someone before going to war. He married, Louisa tells the salesman, and she lets slip how she once was in love before with a married doctor. They have a sexual encounter, and the narrative jumps ahead to an unfortunate event. Jack Agnew, while working at the Dowd's piano factory, is decapitated. He left behind his wife and daughter. The owner of the factory, Arthur Dowd, goes to the widow's home to see what he can do. Grace tells him that he could return all the books her husband had taken from the library. He had gone every Saturday just to take them and never check them out. Arthur does so and meets Louisa. He visits the library often, and after closing, he and Louisa sit, and he mentions that he wants to marry her. The narrative jumps again, and Louisa is in London, Ontario, to meet with a heart doctor. In the office, while waiting, she sees a newspaper article mentioning the 120th annual celebration of the Tall Puddle Martyrs, and one of the speakers was Jack Agnew. She is intrigued and goes to the park where the celebration was to have taken place after her doctor's visit, but then decides to go to the train station and to go home instead. Although the station wasn't there and had moved, she eventually finds it and waits. Just then a man comes by and sits with her. It's Jack Agnew. He tells Louisa that he married Grace and had a daughter, and that Grace had arthritis, and Lillian is married and teaches high school math. Louisa is puzzled and tries to figure out how to tell Jack that Grace remarried and Lillian never finished school and works at a drugstore. Louisa tells Jack about her life with Arthur and how she helped run the factory even when there were only 3 workers, and how she had a son that called her Mud, and that the factory was on the brink of collapse with low wages. He thanks her for the library and says he needs to go. The narrative jumps to the past, when Louisa was first hired by Mr. Dowd. She moves into the commercial hotel and is struck by the town of Carstairs. She sees the homes and the factories and is grateful for a new start. I'm starting to fall in love with Alice Munro's writing. She is often regarded as the Canadian Chekhov, and we can see why here in Carried Away. There isn't much going on in terms of a story, in terms of a plot, but there is a psychological focus on the characters. There's also a focus on relentless movement forward, is sort of obsessed with time. You get a sense of time is running out in this short story. Munro's writing here has a strong regional focus. It's particularly focused on the small Canadian town of Carstairs. There's also a big focus on the omniscient narrator of the story, who seems to be sort of aware of everything that's happening and is trying to make sense of this fractured narrative of this life of Louisa. So the male characters are depicted as an everyman. Jack Agnew, Arthur Dowd, they're depicted as just hardworking men who just have a strong sense of family and a strong work ethic, just the working man, as compared to the women who are definitely depicted as more complex. So there's also a sense of a gothic theme, a sense of foreboding, a sense of time slipping away, and a slow revelatory detail. So the first theme we're going to be focusing in on is intertextuality and how it lends itself to the argument of capitalism first. So Alice Munro uses books and other literature, loved and read by the characters, to reveal certain themes. After Jack's unfortunate accident, and after Arthur Dowd agrees to take back the books that Jack has taken from the library, we realize that Jack has in his possession Bertrand Russell's Bolshevism and Practice and Theory. And Bolshevism originated in Russia early in the 19th century at that time. So it was a socialist political thought at that time that put forth the ideal of a proletariat dictatorship. So obviously capitalism was put down. So it's no wonder that Jack Agnew at the time of his death was working at a piano factory. You can imagine just the meager low wages he was working for, the poor working conditions, and him reading Bertrand Russell's Bolshevism, Practice and Theory just upheld this notion of capitalism. It undermines capitalism, obviously. Also in his possession was G.K. Chesterton's What's Wrong with the World. And Chesterton was a literary figure, just a sort of a thinker of the times. One characteristic of Chesterton is that he championed the working man. He championed family, the working man, and when we look at Jack Agnew, that's exactly who he is. So Alice Munro uses the vulnerability of bodies in this short story. Jack Agnew and his death is sort of a criticism against capitalism and how frail our bodies are in the working class, and how vulnerable, frail, and disadvantaged, disenfranchised the working classes. And so that is her sort of critique on capitalism. And we also see the theme of capitalism play out in the character Arthur Dowd. He is the piano factory owner, after all. He is the future husband of Louisa. And at the time of the accident, we see that Arthur Dowd really does not take responsibility for it. He just sort of reiterates this slogan that he has posted on his wall that says, be careful, watch your step, you can hurt yourself, you can hurt others. But, it's just a sort of plaque on the wall to remind the workers to be careful. And he doesn't really take responsibility of Jack's unfortunate demise. So Mr. Dowd, in a sort of blackly comical sense, when he goes to Grace after Jack's death, his widow's house, and he pats himself on the back because he's willing to pay for Jack's tombstone, and he tells her, you can get whatever you want written on it, and I'll pay for it no matter what the cost. And he pats himself on the back. He makes sure he feels good about himself that he's paying for the tombstone of Jack, but he doesn't really, he gives no forethought of Grace and their daughter's future, right? They were without a father, they were without an income at this time, and he just doesn't, he's oblivious to it. And Louisa too, once she meets Arthur Dowd, she realizes he is the boss, he is the factory owner. She sort of asks him what happened, and he tells her, you have to have your wits about you, never let up for a second. A machine is your servant, and it is an excellent servant, but it makes an imbecile master. And she kind of retorts to him and says, well, I suppose there are no ways of protecting people, but you must know all about that. So she has her criticisms too against Arthur Dowd. She realizes that, maybe the factory has poor working conditions. And Arthur Dowd later on, when he is working with Louisa in the factory and they're working together, he buys himself a new car, and he tells himself and he tells Louisa, I have to buy this car to meet the expectations of my workers. They expect me to show my wealth, but there's none of it for themselves. The next thing we're going to lightly touch upon is feminism, and is only lightly touched upon in this short story. At the very beginning of the short story, we see a dentist who sees Louisa often in the commercial hotel dining room, and he had explained that he thought her attractive, but he didn't know what to make of a woman drinking wine by herself, and he had never seen a woman drinking spirits. And later, when Louisa later meets and has that one-night stand with Jim Frary, the traveling salesman, he remarks, What happened with a woman like that? Sometimes just bad luck or bad judgment at a time when it mattered. A little too sharp, a little self-assured. In the old days, making the men uneasy. There's just slight hints of feminism in here, meaning that, you know, she had more freedom. She had more of a sense of freedom and self-confidence, and it kind of startled or kind of maybe repelled some of the men. And also, you know, Louisa being a traveling saleswoman at that time was very unusual. It wasn't the norm. You also have the instance of Louisa too, when Arthur dies, she alone takes care of the factory. She alone is the boss and the owner, and she makes sure that things are working. And at that time, for her to be her own boss and run her own company. So you have those small senses of feminism in there too. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be talking about is equality. The story sort of touches upon this as well. So we realize that Alice Munro at the end of the story is bringing in a historical event, a true story, a true historical event, and about the Tall Puddle Martyrs. And just to give a little bit of background information, the Tall Puddle Martyrs, and I'm sure I'm probably decimating the pronunciation of this, so Tall Puddle Martyrs, sorry. So it was a democratic socialist group, basically 6 agricultural workers in England in 1834. They were arrested because they were swearing an oath during the time of a labor dispute against cutting wages. The group that they had formed was named the Friendly Society of Agricultural Laborers, and they at first refused to work for less than 10 shillings a week, and later, but they ended up doing that anyway. They ended up working for 7 to 6 shillings per week, and then after that they had enough. What had happened is, after they had been arrested for protesting the low wages of agricultural work, they were arrested and they were transported to Australia. And then after many protests in England, they were able to come back. They came back to England, and then they eventually migrated to Canada, London, Canada. And this is where Louisa is at the end of the novel. At the end of the story, the 120th anniversary of the Tall Puddle Martyrs. She realizes Jack Agnew is there. And it's just another notion of equality, working for good wages. It's just a notion of equality and making sure that the agricultural workers are getting their just due. And that's another theme in Alice Munro's short story. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the reconciling of potentialities and realities. So intertextuality comes into play for this theme as well. So at the beginning of Louisa and Jack's correspondence, Louisa mentions some of her favorite authors, and one of them she mentions Thomas Hardy, and how she realizes that Hardy can be gloomy, but it is true to life. And indeed, as you read the story of Alice Munro's Carried Away, there is a somber tone, a gloomy tone, as we witness Louisa have high hopes for this, romance, this potential life with Jack Agnew, and all for it to fall apart. And it just never went her way. When Louisa is speaking to Jim, and she tells him what had happened with Jack and their letters and stuff, and how he had once claimed his love for her, and she had waited for him, leaving that library open so that maybe once the war was over and he'd return, he would meet her at the library, but he never did. And once she had said that he had left a note saying that he was already engaged before the war, and that he, honored that engagement, she just wonders why. She just wonders, maybe he was disappointed with the way she looked in person, because she had sent a picture of herself to him, and maybe that once he had seen her from afar, that he kind of backed away from it. But Jim Ferry says no, that can't be the case, that perhaps that he just got carried away with the fantasy of it all, that he felt that probably because Jack did feel that impending doom and that death was at his doorstep, that he had felt just the freedom to say whatever he wanted to say, but that he really didn't possibly mean it. And maybe he did mean it at that time, but he just wanted to dive into the fantasy and not really think about reality. Louisa, who is also a Willa Cather fan, and going back to intertextuality, we realize that when she's writing to Jack, she mentions Willa Cather, and Willa Cather also has a sense of romance, or she's a romantic. So it's no wonder she is a fan of Willa Cather, and that Louisa is a romantic. She falls for Jack, and she has this idea built of him as a sort of ideal man. And he does say, while he is writing Louisa, this is probably what made her fall in love with him. He says, "I'm not trying to worry you or get your sympathy either, but just explain how the idea I won't ever see Carstairs again makes me think I can say anything I want. I guess it's like being sick with a fever, so I will say I love you. I think of you up on a stool at the library, reaching to put a book away, and I come up and put my hands on your waist and lift you down, and you turning around inside my arms as if we agreed about everything." Hold on, let me just take a moment. Louisa is a romantic. This is the fantasy that she built up in her mind, and it clashes with the realities, the harsh realities that she faces later on when she does marry Arthur Dowd, and she works and continues to work. That is her life. She is a hard worker. And we realize that maybe Jack felt the same way about her. We realize that he possibly had that fantasy, and that fantasy had lived with him through all those years, because why else would he go to the library every Saturday, just watching and observing her from afar, never actually going up to her and meeting her, talking with her, never making his face known, but just going every Saturday night to steal library books. He once had that fantasy, and he probably held it in his mind and in his heart for so many years. But also the realities of his family life, his job, and her job, her family life, was what happened. But it's just something that you have to kind of wonder, was it any more real than what she had felt? Was her true reality any more real than what she had really hoped for and what she had really felt in her heart? At the end of the story, she sees Jack at the bus stop, but how? How does she see him at the end of the bus stop? Because we know that Jack is dead, and we don't know. The story never really says whether it's a hallucination, if it's a dream, if she's dead already, or if she's dying and just the nerves are just firing off in her brain, and all of a sudden, Jack appears. We don't know. Alice Munro never makes it clear, which is great. It doesn't really matter, because she sees Jack, and at this moment she's able to reconcile and offer a healing for herself and for Jack. He begins telling her of his wife and his child, and the accomplishments of his daughter being a math teacher. And Alice Munro, when she writes that Jack was the speaker for this Tall Puddle Martyrs celebration, either it's Louisa or the narrator giving Jack a new story. They're rewriting Jack's future. He's no longer dead. So he's an equal rights activist. He is still married to Grace. He's proud of his daughter, who is a math teacher. And this, whether it's Louisa or the narrator, is giving Jack another chance, another life. So reconciling what could have been to the actual realities. This time, though, Louisa is not with Jack. They don't come together, and it's not the reunion that you would think would happen, or maybe even the reunion that you would hope for, that they would be together forever and they would fall in love again and be together. But it's just, not how life is sometimes. And it goes back to the notion, too, of Chesterton's values, right? The value of the family man, the value of the working man, and it is all encapsulated in Jack Agnew at the end of this story. He is a freedom fighter. No, I'm sorry, he's not a freedom fighter. He's an equal rights activist. He is proud of his family. So those are the same values that Chesterton had, and that we realize that is probably what Jack Agnew felt also, that those are the things that he valued too. And Louisa, in her mind, knows this because she remembers that Jack Agnew had checked out that book, and that he was reading Chesterton at that time about the working man and how important life is, and to be a good husband and to be a good father. And so Louisa, based on the books that Jack had checked out, and she realizes, and she kind of crafts this ending to Jack and his character and his person. She tells him of her own family too, and how she also had a child and a family. She married Arthur, and she had her own factory. She was able to keep the factory open during the Depression. And also, even when there was only 3 workers in the factory, she was able to keep it all together, even though she realizes the factory is falling apart and the wages were too low for the factory workers. And she prides herself in her ability to keep it all together and to keep working. And she mentions at the end of the story that that's all there is work. And that's what she has always done throughout her life, is work these different jobs. And that has given her, a sense of value, I suppose. The story goes back, it's fragmented, of course, but it goes back in time, and she is at the beginning of her stay at Carstairs. She's arrived at Carstairs because she never grew up there. She arrives at Carstairs. She just had gotten the job from Mr. Dowd, Arthur's father, for the library, and she's looking out. This is how the story ends. She's looking out of the commercial hotel, out of the window, and she's just enchanted by Carstairs as she looks out of the window, and she sees the houses, and she can see the factory, she can see the hospital and all these different places, and she's grateful for a new life. And this sort of kind of goes back to the beginning. This story maybe is about coming back full circle, that she has gone through all of these motions, and she's gone through all of this life and has experienced many, many different things. And that, the next step is actually a new step, something new for her. And it's very interesting. So I still don't know what to make of the ending. I still don't know whether Jack was really dead or whether that was a hallucination in her mind, and what the ending truly means when she's looking at the commercial hotel and she's grateful for a new start. So I highly recommend this short story by Alice Munro. Please check out her other short stories as well. She's a brilliant writer. Her stories stay with you. The characters are they kind of just settle in your heart, and you really think about the themes long after you read the stories. I highly recommend Alice Munro. So thank you so much for watching, and please like, subscribe, leave a comment if you have time to read Carried Away by Alice Munro. I highly suggest it. Come back to the video, leave a comment, tell me what you think. Next month, the month of May, for the book club 2023, we're going to be reading Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. So I'm really excited about that. I started reading it in high school, then I kind of got distracted by life and things, but I'm excited to get back to it and just delve right into that sort of fantasy anyway. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.